If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke chapter 5. This is where we'll be spending our time today. Luke chapter 5. By the time I'll start over. When I was walking back just now, I thought to myself, I wonder what everybody here thinks about the fact that Sunday in and Sunday out, we kind of do the same things. We do. I used to, when I first came here 12 years ago, I printed out an order of worship on a piece of paper. And I didn't do that because I just wanted to try to make something official. I did it because in my own mind, I needed to keep things straight as to what was next in the service. And now I don't print that anymore. I guess after 12 years, you get used to what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. But there are two aspects to that regularity. One of them is dangerous. We're going to look at that today. One of them, though, is good. The regularity, in some ways, provides a simple structure where God can show up and use the moments that we expect things to happen in certain ways to show up and do things in us that if we didn't know what was going to happen next, we might miss Him. So there's an important feature there. But by the time of Jesus, Judaism had become absolutely rigid. Everything about it was known. Everybody knew what they were supposed to do, when they were supposed to do it, what was expected. Of course, the oral law was so complicated by the time of Jesus that nobody except the intelligentsia really knew how they were to obey it, because they were the only ones who knew what was expected at all. But this challenge to the order is what Jesus brought. And so what I'd like for us to do today is take a look at that challenge to that order and decide for ourselves, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Let's take a look at verse 33, which is where I'll begin reading. Luke chapter 5, verse 33. They said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray. So do the disciples of the Pharisees, but your disciples eat and drink. Jesus said, can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will leave, and in those days they will fast. Jesus then told them a parable. He said, no one tears a patch from a new garment and sews it onto an old one. If they do, the new one will tear the old one away, and the new one will not match. No one pours new wine into an old wineskin, because if they do, the wineskin will burst and the wine will run out, and the wineskin itself will be ruined. No new wine must be poured into a new wineskin, and no one after drinking the old wine says, I would like to have the new wine, because they like the old wine just as well. Now this little parable that Jesus tells is kind of confusing in some ways. For me it is anyway. Maybe I'm the only one. But let's take a look at it and try to unpack it. Jesus is explaining to people, he's explained to us and these who were there that day, that there are certain things in which we become habituated. And those habits become like track ruts going across the... When people traveled west in wagons, there are no roads. There were wagon ruts. And you put your wagon in those ruts and headed toward the setting sun, and you would go west. And those ruts had been established. Well, we're kind of like that. And for the Jews at the time of Jesus, Judaism had become like the wagon wheel ruts. It had become a drudgery. Everything was given to them to do, when to do it. They fasted on Monday, they fasted on Thursday. They offered prayer at 12, they offered prayer at 3, they offered prayer at 6. All of the orchestrations of the temple were known. Absolutely everybody knew what to expect. They knew when to show up. They knew what was going to happen. And the Pharisees, lots of them, when it came time for their fast on Monday and Thursday, they would put white chalk on their faces when they went out. It's kind of like makeup, if you think about it. They'd put this white chalk on their faces and they would go out so that everybody in the street would know on Monday they were fasting. They wanted it known. Every aspect of Orthodox Jewish life was rigidly performed and rigidly laid out. John's disciples, John the Baptist's disciples, were much like this. They were very rigid in their orthodoxy. John was an ascetic. He didn't live in town. He didn't live in a house. He lived out in the wilderness. He ate off the land. He survived, and his disciples did the same thing. So when the Pharisees challenged Jesus in this moment, they're looking at themselves and they're looking at John's disciples and saying, I don't understand. Your disciples seem like they're just sort of happy. They're eating and they're drinking and they're enjoying themselves. How come they don't fast? What the Pharisees were actually asking Jesus is, who's the best Jew? Who's the best Jew? Now, the Pharisees, like some of John's disciples, you remember John the Baptist when he was in prison? He sent somebody to come to Jesus and say, are you the one? Remember that? I mean, how could he's the one who baptized him and said, there's somebody coming whose sandals I'm not fit to untie. But then he got put in prison and he started to question, is this really the one? How do I know it? What am I looking for? Because Jesus challenged all of the Jewish orthodoxy as they understood it to be. Now, Jesus was the perfect Jew. He's perfect. If you want to know what perfect Judaic practice is, all you've got to do is look at the Jewish Messiah. He did it perfectly. But the people at the time didn't see it that way. They disliked what they saw in Jesus. They disliked the fact that he seemed to just be dismissive of the rules that they all obeyed, the oral law that had accumulated since Moses. And Jesus just ignored it. That's why they said of him, your disciples are eating and drinking. In other words, they seem free in a way that we're not free. We're bound by these rules. Your disciples are free. They just kind of do what they want. They do what they like. They eat when they want. They eat what they want. They're not bound by all of these restrictions. Why did the Jewish intelligentsia dislike that so much? Well, I think that's just an absolutely common human ailment. We see it in churches today. You can go into a congregation and you can find people who are really rigid about their observance. They find all the texts in Paul and they say, see all these things we're not supposed to do. Look at me, how well I'm doing those things. And when they find somebody in a congregation who seems to be enjoying the presence of God and not doing those things very well, guess what? They don't like that at all. They don't like it at all. So the Jews are like that. These Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians, the Sadducees, they're looking at Jesus' disciples and they're saying, and they're looking at Jesus even worse. They're saying, you are making us miserable. We want you to be as miserable as we are. That's what they're saying. Now, that brings me to a question as I look at Jesus' life. I say, okay, he is the most Orthodox Jew that has ever lived. You believe that? I mean, this is God Almighty incarnate. If anybody wants to know what Judaism is, they could surely ask Jesus. Surely he would know, right? I mean, he invented the whole thing. So he knows what's going on here. He knows how to behave. He knows what to do. Fasting is only given did you know this? Fasting is only given in the Old Testament once. One time. And it's not just fasting from food necessarily. So that's something where the oral law had changed what was going on. The kinds of fasts that God likes, read Isaiah 58. There you find what kinds of fasts God likes. That's what he wants to see. But what had happened over time was just what happens in any structure like this. We do it, the Jews did it. We start to apply all kinds of rules of behavior to people, and we expect them to obey them. We do. And then what does that do to us? It brings us to a place in our own life as Christians where we start asking really hard questions about how we're living. Is what I'm doing here okay with God? Is what I'm doing here not okay with God? How will I know? Well, I can tell you one way that's not to know. And that's not to look around. Because most of us are getting a lot of this wrong. Most of us. So, what happens? Well, following the Lord becomes just an utter drudgery. That's what had happened to the Jews. And the drudgery, the more what's the word, what is the adverb for drudgery? The more drudgeretic it became, I don't even know if that's a word, the more like a drudgery it becomes, the better a Jew you are. I remember talking to a pastor once who talked about his congregation, and he referred to them as the chosen frozen. And I thought it was kind of funny, but then I wonder why he said that. Well, that was the view that they had as a congregation. The more miserable I am as a Christian, the better a Christian I am. The more miserable following Jesus makes me, the better at it I am. It's kind of like that whole reversal of what faith is in some ways. The more blind it is, the better it is. No, that's not the way it works at all. And it's the same with following Jesus. The more like a drudgery it is, that doesn't make it better. You can go back and read the whole book of Colossians sometimes and read Paul's admonitions there regarding forcing our bodies into certain molds as though somehow that makes us better as followers of Jesus. It doesn't. It doesn't. Jesus looks at his disciples and he looks at following him as a wedding feast. Now, I've played Jewish weddings. I've played music at Jewish weddings, and I can tell you, we Protestants do not know how to make a party happen. We don't. And we're okay at it, but the Jews, when they have a wedding, it's a party. And everybody coming there expects a party. They expected, and when Jesus was around, the parties lasted a week. You know, they didn't go rent the Holiday Inn ballroom for 4 hours and have a party. They'd rent the thing for a week. And wine flowed, alcohol flowed, shouting, dancing, eating, everything that you could possibly, and of course some of that doesn't appeal to me, the dancing part. I'm not any good at that. So that part of the party would not be a party for me. If they said, come to the dance, that'd be the place I would not show up. But for the Jewish wedding feasters, it was a party. And they came fully expectant. Remember Jesus in John 2? They're at the wedding feast in Cana. They've got gallons of wine, but they're running out. So Jesus obliges them and takes 120 gallons of water and turns it into 120 gallons of the best wine. And the guy says, I don't understand. We usually save the best wine, use it up first, and then once everybody's good and snockered, we give them the bad wine and they don't know the difference anymore. You've saved the best wine for last. There's a picture there in what Jesus is trying to communicate to you and to me and to the Pharisees when he spoke to them about what it is to follow him. It is the opposite of a drudgery to follow Jesus. So this picture of what a disciple is for the Jews is the opposite of what it is to be a disciple of Jesus, a complete opposite. The status quo, though, had become a drudgery, and everybody in Judaism at the time expected a drudgery. They looked at the whole picture of what it was to be a good Jew. The more like a drudgery it was, the better you were at it. I remember I was reading for this and I caught this little magazine article. It was about a guy who had dandelions in his yard. I've never bothered about dandelions because it's kind of a pretty little flower, you know. I guess when they get tall is when they're a problem. I don't really know much about them. But he couldn't get rid of them. You know, in the Northeast, it's a really big deal. Dandelions are a really big deal in the Northeast. You got what's called tall fescue. It's this skinny grass, real pretty and green. But dandelions make gaps in it because their leaves spread out and the grass can't grow up through it because fescue is not real stiff. It's not like these carpet grasses we have here. So he went to the county extension agent and he said, how do I get rid of the dandelions? Well, they took soil samples and they did all kinds of stuff. And 3 or 4 weeks passed and he didn't hear anything. So he went back. County extension agent was sitting at the desk and he said, did you get my soil samples? Yep, got them. Here's your soil report. He said, well, what am I to do about the dandelions? And the county extension agent just closed the drawer and said, you're just going to have to get used to them. Just going to have to get used to it. That's kind of what has happened to Judaism at the time of Jesus. It's a drudgery. Just get used to it and get over it. I think for us as Christians, the effort of overcoming day in and day out as a believer, it begins to build in us a certain apathy about what it is to follow God. And so we start, I'll say this of Rip. Rip is guilty of this. We start to look at what it is to follow Jesus as, if I'm really down and miserable, I'm actually doing a better job of following than I would be if I weren't. We equate overcoming. Listen to the language that we use about ourselves so often. Overcoming, victory. What does all that imply? It implies a battlefield, doesn't it? And how many people enjoy a battlefield? Not too many. So there's got to be something about this that we're just not seeing. The key is what Jesus gives us here. We equate happiness and joy as the same thing. We don't see the two different. I remember reading of Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa's job and all those people who worked with her in Nirmade, what they did was they cared for people who were going to die. That's all they did. They weren't feeding the hungry. They weren't taking care of people who had means. They were caring for the people who in India would be put on the sidewalk, left out of the hospitals, can't come in anymore. We're just going to let you die on the sidewalk, and because of karma, that's okay. I mean, that's your karma. That's what's happened to you. Sorry about that. And so in India, that was a common thing. And Mother Teresa of Calcutta, saw that, and she said, I've got to do something about this. So their ministry was to feed and care and provide comfort for people who were dying. They were going to die. How can you find joy in something like that? Every day, your job is to go take care of a person you know in a few days, weeks, hours, whatever it's going to be, is going to die. That's hard to see happiness there. But Jesus is not talking about happiness, he's talking about joy. And I wanted today, maybe this is something you've never thought about, maybe you've all thought about it, and this whole sermon's a waste of time, I don't know, we'll see. But I want us to look at what it is that Jesus is trying to get us to understand about what it is he's saying, comparing the drudgery of Judaism to the wedding feast of following him. What is it? The wineskin analogy is the clue. What is the new wine that Jesus is trying to pour into the new wineskin? What is it? You have to go all the way back and realize the new wine is a very, very old wine. In fact, it's the oldest wine that can be found. What Jesus is telling us is, I challenge anybody, look at it very carefully. Go home, maybe today, if you are reminded of this, and read the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Read them very carefully. Look as hard as you can for a worship service in those first 2 chapters. You won't find one. Unless I miss something, you're not going to find it. All right? When the first 2 humans, however you want to read that, the first 2 humans were here, what was their occupation toward worshiping God? What was it? They just had to be who they were. They just had to be. They were 2 humans. God had placed them in the garden. They were to care for the garden, be fruitful and multiply. Everything's provided for you. You have no need. What worship were they to do? They were to just be. That's the new wine. That's the wine that Jesus is trying to get all of us back to. You see, what we're doing as Christians is not who we are as Christians. What we are, who we are, is what God is looking for. He's looking for you. He's looking for me. God was worshipped by the first 2 humans just in their reflectance back to Him. Think of it from the standpoint of a parent. What parent, watching their little kid learn to swim, doesn't just take an enormous sense of satisfaction or a little kid learning how to add or read or ride a bicycle or do anything that we expect human beings to do in their travels from infanthood to adulthood. We all of us feel that. God is looking at us the same way. The same way. What was in the garden was a father enjoying watching his children live and learn and grow and be. That's the wine. That's the wine that cannot be poured into an old wineskin. It will burst it. The key feature of the garden was one thing: contentment. Contentment. What is contentment? The best definition, I wish I'd have made it up. It was an elderly pastor. I was at a conference. This pastor said, "Do you know what contentment is?" And I'm thinking, no, not really. Can you tell me? He said, "People in the world think that contentment is having whatever you want." He said, "They're wrong." He said, "Contentment is wanting what you have." I thought, wow, that's the best definition I've ever heard. Wanting what we have. Contentment in our culture, what is the goal of an advertisement in our culture? What's the goal? Any advertisement. It's to rob us of the contentment with what we have. That's what it's there for. Our whole economy is built upon robbing everybody of their contentment so that they'll want the next thing. Well, I've got a serviceable car out there, but that car's not good enough. I need this car. I got to have this one. And so every few years, the serviceable vehicle gets dispensed with. We put ourselves in debt for another one. The advertising works. It takes away the contentment that we have. Now, I'm not picking on cars. I mean, you could extrapolate that into ties, pants, shoes. It doesn't make any difference. The things that we find contentment in are not the things that Jesus is trying to get us to find contentment in at all. He's trying to get us to find contentment in this new wine that he's talking about. What is the new wine? It's the old wine of what it is to live in front of God and walk and to simply be. Paul says it. Romans chapter 12. What is it that we are to do as our spiritual service of worship? Offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. That covers everything. There's nothing outside of that. That means God doesn't want what we can do for Him. He wants us. He wants each one of us in this room in the way that He has made us to offer ourselves to Him. And in that, we're going to find out what G.K. Chesterton said about orthodoxy. For the Jewish orthodoxy at the time of Jesus, it had become a drudgery. G.K. Chesterton talks about orthodoxy in his little book, Orthodoxy, speaking to you and me as followers of Jesus, and says, we look at orthodoxy like it's some kind of dry, mundane, boring thing. Orthodoxy is like a tiger, he says. It's the most exciting and dangerous thing that we can possibly do. I believe that. To follow Jesus, to really follow Him, to come to Him and say, Lord, I'm giving you myself. Everything that I am now belongs to you. That's dangerous. That's exciting. That's like a tiger. We have a phrase, we say somebody's comfortable in their own skin. I bet Adam and Eve were comfortable in their own skin, in the good way. But we talk about it in a way that somehow breeds an apathy. Orthodoxy that Jesus is trying to get us to see is never going to breed an apathy. It's always going to breed a comfort in our own skin that sets us free to be exactly who God called us to be, right here and right now. It's not fitting schedules. It's not fitting into the old way of doing things. We do the same things here at church every Sunday, but I promise you, God shows up in people's hearts. He shows up. Westminster Catechism, the shorter one, says, what's the chief aim for the human being? What is it? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Do you know what it is to glorify God? What do we think about? We think about missionaries, or we think about serving the poor, or we think about doing something. No. It might be those things, but to glorify God is to enjoy Him. You can't glorify God without enjoying Him. You can't enjoy Him without glorifying Him. The two things are just absolutely the same. To enjoy Him is to worship Him. And what does that place us? A little closer to the garden, the way it was always intended to be. always intended to be. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me,